Hi, Scott.
Hi, Matt.
So two marks of a genuine church, the right preaching of God's word and the right application of the ordinances, being baptism and the Lord's Supper. And on the night that Jesus died, he instituted the Lord's Supper. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the Lord's Supper was instituted by the Lord himself, by Jesus. And he did this at the Last Supper, just before he went to the cross to die for the sins of his people. And it's the Last Supper, it was the same time as the Passover meal that the Jews were celebrating at that time. And so the parallels with the Passover supper, where a lamb is slaughtered and its blood is used for the sins of the people, marks across directly to Jesus, as he is the Passover lamb, that his body is broken for sins and his blood is shed or poured out for the sins of his people. So that's essentially what's going on with the Lord's Supper. As we take the bread and we take the wine, they're symbols representing his body that's broken and his blood that's poured out for the sins of his people, for the forgiveness of their sins.
Great. So these symbols, bread and wine, you mentioned that they're for God's people. Do you want to say a bit more about who this meal is for?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so when he was instituting the Lord's Supper, it was to his disciples. They were in the upper room and they had their faith in him, and he said to them, do this in remembrance of me. So it's not to the world around, it's not to the world in general, it's only to those who are considered part of his church, his followers, his disciples. So it's for all of those who have put their faith in Jesus to forgive them for their sins and who follow him in obedience to his teaching.
Great. And there's nothing special that happens with the bread and wine, is there, in the Lord's Supper?
Nothing at all, Matt. And to pick up a word you've already used, it's symbolic. It's a symbol of Jesus' body and his blood that was poured out and his body that was broken for us. Nothing magical happens. There's nothing mystical at all.
Is there a passage in the Bible that you would take us which helpfully explains what's going on in the Lord's Supper?
Yeah. I mean, a really good one, a foundational one, Matt, is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And in the context here, it's written to the church in Corinth, and Paul is writing, and he's explaining to them sort of the proper way in which the Lord's Supper should be taken and shared.
Great. So by the proper way, you're saying that there's a way that believers can take the Lord's Supper in an improper way, in an unworthy manner.
Yeah, and he says that here. So remember, he's writing to the church. He's not writing to people that don't know Jesus. He's writing to people that love him and follow him. And he says this in verse 27. So then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. And by that he means sinning against the church, which is the body of Jesus, and the blood of the Lord. That's the sacrifice for sins, for the forgiveness of sins. And you can do it in an unworthy manner. You can take it in an unworthy manner. If you go back a few verses, he's talking about that unworthy manner. He's saying to the church in Corinth, brothers and sisters in Corinth, when you come together, there's divisions among you. When you eat a meal, you immediately split off into little groups. And those groups could be based on languages that you speak, or based upon those who are rich and those who are poor, and you don't want to mix with each other. Or it could just be that, well, hey, you're like me, let's get together and we'll just have our own little clique. He's saying that's unworthy, guys. That is the wrong way in which to take the Lord's Supper. So we have that in the passage itself. The passage also talks about Jesus, that Jesus is God. He's also the Son of God. Now, he has to be God to be the perfect sacrifice, that Passover lamb. So if people are taking the Lord's Supper and they don't believe that Jesus is truly God, they're taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, and they should stop. One final one for you, Matt. Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is preaching, and he says, if you take your sacrifice to the temple and you're about to offer it up to God, and you remember you're in dispute with a brother or a sister, leave your sacrifice, run to them, be reconciled to them, then come back, take that sacrifice and offer it up to God. So, if you've fallen out with a Christian and you haven't tried to reconcile, Jesus is saying you should try to reconcile, because if you don't, you could be at risk of taking the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner.
Right. So you're saying that there might be situations where you would withhold the Lord's Supper from people in church?
Well, in God's word, we actually see that happening, Matt. So the answer would be yes, based upon God's word. Go back a couple of chapters to chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, and we see Paul writing to the church there, and he's saying, listen, you've got a case here of gross sin in a sexual context, and you have to discipline that brother. Well, part of that discipline would be withholding the Lord's Supper from him. If they didn't, they're essentially saying, we condone your lifestyle, we condone this gross sin that you're performing. So they would have to withhold it if they didn't want to be part of it.
And practically, as a church, what does it look like to celebrate the Lord's Supper?
Yeah, so for us, Matt, here in this Baptist church, what we do, we would sing a hymn of praise to God. We'd then open up God's word. We'd read from a passage like 1 Corinthians 11 and explain it briefly. Then we would break bread, one loaf representing, the unity, one church. We'd break it, we'd share the bread out, we'd all take the bread together, doing that in remembrance of Jesus until the day that he returns, as he says he will. Then we'll distribute the wine, and we'll all take the wine together, again remembering his blood that was shed for us for the forgiveness of sins. And then we'd probably end on a prayer and then singing another hymn of praise to God.
Great. Well, thanks for that really helpful overview of the Lord's Supper.
Thanks, Matt.